Hello and welcome to my channel. This snowy scene with a little kitten is going to be done in graphite pencils. I'm going to use Faber Castell graphite pencils. But I'm going to use two types, the regular graphite pencils and the matte graphite pencils. First I'm going to do a quick freehand sketch, and I put the reference in the top right corner so that you can follow along. Sometimes I just put it in the description, but maybe this is easier for you. Anyway, as you can see, I'm going to be drawing this kitten, and I'm just going to do a quick sketch with an HB pencil to try to get the overall shape of the cat to look close to what I see in the reference. Now I'm going to use a little trick. This is not a pencil. This is just a pointed stick, and I'm going to make some indentations with it. Some invisible lines. So I'm mostly going to use these for the whiskers, because the whiskers are thin white lines, and those can be a little bit difficult, a little bit tricky to draw with erasers. So once I start working over that with my pencils and graphite powder, you'll see that the white lines will start showing up. I'm also going to go over one part of my sketch with a slightly darker pencil so that I wouldn't lose all of the sketch I've done, because I plan to cover a good part of this with some graphite powder. Now I'm going to use a bit of graphite powder. My idea is to create a vignette, and it's going to be a little bit messy in this initial stage because I'm gonna lay down a little bit of graphite just to have a base value or base tone to work with, and then I'm going to be adding details of lighter and darker value as needed. First I'm going to do a little bit of blending with a paper towel. Paper towels, tissues, they blend really well, especially larger, lighter areas. Now you can see that those whiskers are starting to show up. My plan is working. So as I've already explained, I simply used a pointed stick to make some marks, indentations in the paper. And once you go over them, either with a pencil or with graphite powder, white lines, white shapes start to appear. Why did I choose this approach rather than an eraser? Because it can be a little bit difficult to erase such fine, clean lines with clean edges. So this is going to make things easier for me. Anyway, I'm going to move in with a pencil now, as I need to start working on the left side of the cat's body, the ear and the head first, because I normally work from left to right and from top to bottom, because I'm right-handed and I want to minimize the smudging. And another trick that I like to use to minimize the smudging is, of course, using this piece of glassine paper under my hand. Now, when I use that graphite powder, I used a graphite powder created by sharpening or crushing one of my woodless graphite pencils. And I suggest, if you want to do that, to use something a little bit more substantial, a little bit softer, like a 4B or a 6B. I used a 6B, which means that I already have a decent amount of value in the background, so the 6B that I tried to use isn't really showing up as much as I wanted it to, It is showing up, but I needed a little bit more contrast, which is why I switched to matte graphite pencils. For those who are not familiar, let me just explain real quick. You have the regular Faber Castell 9000 series graphite pencils, which are very good graphite pencils. And then you also have the Pitt graphite matte pencils, also Faber Castell. These appeared in the market about 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And they are a little bit different from regular graphite pencils because they're matte, they don't have graphite shine, and they're a little bit darker. They're also a little bit more difficult to blend. But I sometimes use one or the other, or sometimes I combine them in a single drawing. Now I'm drawing the eyes, and first I drew the darker shape above the eye, the upper eyelid, because the light source is coming from above and more from the right, so that part of the eye is going to be darker because it's casting a shadow down. Now the eye itself needs to be a little bit lighter, which is why I used a kneaded eraser to lift up a little bit of value and make that portion of the eye which is facing the light source a lot lighter, almost white. So you can tell that for erasing I'm going to be using the kneaded eraser a lot. I normally use a Faber Castell kneaded eraser or a kneadable eraser, and here you can see how I'm using it to lift up a bit of graphite from certain areas to make them lighter. Now the reason why I put the graphite powder in the first place was to create that base tone, because I knew that it would be quicker for me to establish a greater range of value by erasing these larger areas and then adding darker areas in the shadow side. So it's kind of like working on toned paper. You can make your own toned paper by putting down some graphite powder. And the way to make lighter tones is, of course, to lift up the graphite using an eraser. Now you can use a Tombow Mono Zero eraser or a Kohinoor pencil eraser, or you can use a kneaded eraser. The reason why I prefer the kneaded eraser here is because graphite is a lubricant, and it can be a little bit difficult to... There can be a lot of smudging when you try to use regular erasers. They get muddied very quickly. Anyway, I'm starting to work on the left side of the head, and I'm trying to imitate the appearance of the fur while at the same time keeping in mind where the cat's head needs to be darker, because it needs to be darker on the left side. The left side is facing away from the light source. But things are not that simple. If you look at the reference, you will see that the left side of the head, which is facing away from the light source clearly, is very dark. But then as you move lower down on the shoulder area, and especially the hip and the upper back area, you will see that this part of the cat's body is a lot lighter. And it's lighter because it's round, it's protruding slightly, and it's catching some light from that light source. So that's going to need to remain lighter. On the other hand, the lower back is going to be darker because it's facing completely away from the light source and it's in the shadow. Here you can see how nicely these whiskers are showing up even when I'm working on top of them with a pencil. This is why it was so useful for me to have those indentations in place. And now I'm drawing some of these dark spots where the whiskers are growing out of. So I think, as you can see, the cat's head is starting to take shape and it's starting to look three-dimensional, because when using this approach, as I've already explained, it's easier to establish a range of value. You just use the eraser to lift up a little bit of material and you get your highlights, and then you use darker pencils to shade the shadow areas, and you immediately have a 3D looking subject. You were able to create that illusion of volume and depth very quickly. If I were working on toned paper, obviously I would use a combination of black and white pencils or something similar. But here, because I covered everything with graphite previously, I'm using erasers to get those areas of lighter value, like I'm doing here on the neck. This is an area of very light value, this neck and chest area, because it's exposed to the light source. And you can see how I lifted up a little bit of value from there and made it lighter than the rest of the background and the body. Now this upper part of the back is interesting because you have some lighter hair here as well. Not quite as light as on the right side, which is facing the light source directly. But it's a little bit lighter than the rest of the shadow side because it's facing up. And it's also catching a little bit of reflected light from the other side probably. So it's slightly exposed to the light, so it's going to be a little bit lighter, especially its upper part. So while you're shading your main subject, you constantly need to be aware of the position of the light source and how the main subject interacts with that light source. Because if you don't do that, you won't be able to create a realistic looking or a three-dimensional looking drawing. Now, even though I had those white lines in place using the indentation technique, I can always refine them a little bit with a kneaded eraser. But now that head and the neck is mostly done, I'm going to be moving on to the back, and I'm going to be shading this part. When shading any type of subject, there are essentially two types of approaches that you can use. You can, once you have the sketch in place, of course, you can either start from the details, or you can just shade the larger areas, establishing those larger contrasts. I usually like to use some kind of a hybrid approach where I work a little bit on the details, then do a little bit of shading of the larger areas, and I kind of go back and forth. So if you look at the head, I first placed the eye and did some of the details on the eye and the nose before I established the contrast between the light side and the shadow side, the light side on the right and the shadow side on the left. This is because when I put in some of those details, and I don't have to work them out completely, I don't have to refine them completely, I can go back and revise them a little bit later. But the reason why I like to put them in sometimes is because they're kind of like a reference point for me, and they allow me to navigate through the drawing more easily. They allow me to navigate through the drawing more easily when I'm trying to shade the drawing. So I can understand more easily where I need to put areas of darker or lighter value and how much value I need in those areas. This cat has some kind of stripes on its fur, so it's mostly grey and white, but it's two shades or two tones of grey, because you have some of these slightly darker stripes which are dark grey, not exactly black, but they do appear black in the shadow areas on the left. And I'm working on those, imitating the texture of fur, while at the same time keeping in mind which part of the cat's body needs to remain darker because of the shadow. And the way that I'm imitating the appearance of the fur is simply by going back and forth and going or working in the direction of the fur. One of the things I always say when it comes to drawing furry animals is that you need to pay attention to the length of the fur and the direction of the fur, and you need to make sure that you match the length and the direction of the fur with the length and the direction of your strokes. So as long as you can do that, you will end up with a fairly realistic looking fur, which alone is not enough, because you also need to establish those larger contrasts between the lighter areas and the shadow areas. But it's important as well. I'm also using a little bit of blending with a brush. The reason why a brush is useful here is because it can soften my marks. Some of them are a little bit ugly, and it can soften them a little bit, make the fur look a little bit more realistic, a little bit fluffier, and maybe added a bit more volume. So I'm using that because I can't draw every single hair, and because I can't draw every single hair, I need to find ways to create the illusion of density of that fur, and using a brush and softening my marks is one of the best ways to do it. So I'm moving lower down, and this cat is sitting on some kind of a tree stump or something, doesn't really matter. Something that has rough texture, but I'm going to include that. The top edge of that object the cat is sitting on is a bit lighter because obviously it's facing up, but the lower part of the cat's back is dark and it's in the shadow. So here I'm going to use quite a bit more value. So I switched to a 12B. In the Faber Castell range you have these darker, in the Faber Castell matte graphite pencil range you have these slightly darker pencils. And you can see how much contrast I'm able to achieve, not just with the background but also with the rest of the body, of the cat's body. So I'm making this pretty dark, and I know that right now it doesn't look super realistic because I still haven't integrated it into the rest of the body. I simply slapped that patch of darker fur or that shadow area at the bottom. But you'll see once I start making a transition towards those areas of lighter value, it will all start to make sense. And again, I'm drawing some of these stripes, and it's not just stripes, also the cat's fur is bending and creating some folds. So wherever you have longer fur and the cat's body is bending or twisting, you're going to have those folds or those creases, those deeper shadow areas, like for example between the shoulder area and the waist area, or the hip and the waist area. And you also have some of those smaller folds in the skin and the fur on the belly and on the neck, on the hind legs, etc. The position of the cat's body here is very interesting because the hind legs are mostly tucked in, while the neck, the tail is covering them. Kittens, their bodies are a bit different than those of grown-up cats because the head is larger, as you can see, the body is a little bit smaller, the legs are shorter, and the tail is also a little bit shorter and thinner. So I need to capture all of those details and all of those proportions as best as I can. But of course, because this is not a portrait of a human or a portrait of a person, I don't have to worry as much about precision and proportions. So if some of the proportions are a little bit off, doesn't really matter. It's still going to look like a cute kitten. I'm doing a little bit more shading here at the bottom, and now you can see how I'm making that transition between that darkest shadow area at the bottom on the left and the lighter and lighter belly area and the hind leg area just above it and to the right. And of course I'm doing a substantial amount of blending with a brush, and then going back in with a kneaded eraser, lifting up a bit of value where needed, doing two things at the same time. Lifting up the value to make the cat appear more three-dimensional by showing which parts of its body are exposed to the light source, but at the same time imitating the texture of the fur by drawing a few flyaway hairs here and there, so that it really looks like slightly longer fluffy fur. Because one of the things that you have to pay attention to is that the length of the fur varies in different parts of the cat's body. So on the head it's fairly short, but on the rest of the body it's a little bit longer, especially on the belly and the chest area. I'm cleaning up the edge between the chest area and the background, and those front legs in the background. That whole part of the body is lighter, not just because of the light fur, but also because it's facing the light source. And I'm doing a little bit of erasing with the Tombow Mono Zero eraser, so I try to use both erasers, not just the kneaded eraser, but this one as well. And I'm just refining some of the transitions between those darker stripes and the lighter parts of the fur, trying to integrate those darker areas better into the rest of the fur, and also trying to make more of a gradual transition from the shadow side onto the light side, because there are cases in which you need clean edges, and there are those when you need smooth transitions. So if you look at the cat's body, it's kind of round, it's almost like a little sphere, and you have a gradual transition from that shadow area onto the lighter area at the top, which is facing the light source. And the hips are also slightly protruding, so I made them a little bit lighter so that they look like a separate part of the body, but I didn't need to create a clean edge there, just a soft transition, and I made them a little bit lighter at the top. I'm doing a similar thing with the tail to make sure that the tail stands out against the rest of the body. I shaded its lower part a little bit darker, made it a little bit darker, and then the upper part a little bit lighter, so that it both stands out against the rest of the body and so that I stay consistent with the light source. A little bit more refining with a kneaded eraser to make some parts of it a bit lighter, and then we have these paws on the front legs. One of them is visible behind the tail. Now I'm going to work on this tree stump or whatever it is that the cat is sitting on. I'm going to give it a texture of a tree or a texture of wood. It doesn't really matter what it is. Maybe it's concrete, but I can see that it's something rough. I'm going to try to make it look like a tree stump or something. So I'm trying to create an illusion of a rough surface, rough texture with some cracks and irregularities. And I'm also making sure that the left side is darker and this right side is also exposed to the light source, and it's also lighter. Just adding a bit more value here on the on the shadow side. And you can see that the scene is almost done. I'm going to actually leave the background more or less like this because I want it to remain like a vignette. I'm not going to draw all the way to the edges of the paper. I'm just going to add a few more details to the background, as you will see in a minute. Just doing a little bit of erasing here, cleaning up. But like I said, I'm not going to work all the way to the edge of the paper. I like it as a vignette. So I decided to create a slightly different background than what you see in the reference. I wanted a snowy scene. The winter is almost here, and I want some snow, something that the kitten will be looking at. And I'm trying to imitate the effect of the snowflakes on the camera lens. And I'm making some of them a little bit larger than the others, and some of them are going to be a little bit smaller. And I'm kind of going to group them or distribute them randomly, so that somewhere there are just one or two, and in other places there's a little bit more of them grouped together. And I need to have a sufficient amount of them so that the scene looks convincing. And I'm also going to need to draw a few of them in front of the cat, so that the cat looks like a part of that snowy scene. So I hope you liked the choices I made with composition and the background. And I hope you found this video useful. The drawing is now done. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to check out my other videos. Now, if you want to see the full-length narrated version of this video and a lot more other content, you should check out my Patreon. Anyway, that will be all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.